That's good. So we're continuing our studies through our one-word devotional book. And as you notice, this past week's word was resurrection. Just a little bit off-center from this year's Easter celebration. So for Easter we talked about holiness. Now holiness was one of the primary results of the resurrection. Our holiness would not be possible without the resurrection of Jesus. But today, as we just finished up a week of reading about resurrection, and most of our devotional studies throughout the week have dealt more with the personal kind of relationship we have with God because of the resurrection, I wanted to dedicate this sermon to more of a historical take on the resurrection, and that's looking at evidences that we have for the resurrection. Because honestly, I mean, just think about this critically for a second. If a total stranger, comes up to your house, maybe a white shirt and a bicycle and a book in hand, and knocks on your door and says, "Hey, want to let you know that my brother died last week, and we had the funeral for him on Friday, and we buried him, but then he made it back in time for our annual family reunion on Sunday." I bet you probably asked him if he's been hitting up the local tea shop with the green plus sign on the front, right? Because if somebody comes up to you today and says, "Hey, cousin Billy Bob, we put him in the ground a week ago, but he showed up for work today," how crazy would you think that person is? And yet, that's what we tell people about Jesus. Well, Jesus, he was out preaching one day, he died, was buried, and then he came back. And people that don't come from a Christian background, that haven't been acquainted with Scripture and the other evidences for God, they'll kind of look at us like we're crazy. You believe in zombies or something? And yet, when we look at the historical evidence, there's only one conclusion that makes sense of it all. Anthony Flew, he passed away some years ago, but during the 1900s, the mid-1900s, he was known as one of the world's leading atheist philosophers. And yet, towards the end of his life, he had this to say: "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It is outstandingly different in terms of quality of the evidence and quantity of the evidence. There is sufficient evidence for the resurrection of Jesus that we can historically say, yeah, that happened." But I want to focus, before we get in really to the lesson on the resurrection, on the one important contrast that Mr. Anthony Flew here draws, and that's that it's better attested than any other religion. So I want us to consider just very briefly kind of the basis of some of the other leading, most popular religions in the world today. We couldn't possibly cover every religion that's out there, but across these 5-6 different religions, it accounts for some 90% of the world's population, if not greater. So the first one, we consider Hinduism. Eastern religion, popular throughout much of India and spreading from India into a lot of Asia. Its origins of the Hindu religion are largely unknown. Even among their own Hindu scholars, there's debates of, Hinduism started sometime between 2300 and 1500 BC. They worship literally millions of gods. That's not an exaggeration. They have millions of gods, and they have no agreement as to if or which one of them is any better or greater than the rest. And even their own religious writings, which could fill entire libraries, they don't really know where they came from. They don't know the original authors. They can't attest to the veracity of any of them. And it's because even in their own religious texts, the Vedas, there's no specific historical truth claims that are made. As a matter of fact, Hinduism denies that there even is such a thing as truth. So if you say 2 + 2 = 4, the Hindu says, well, that's just your opinion. They deny objective truth exists, and yet Christianity is a little bit different than that, isn't it? But then let's stick with the Eastern religions for a moment, because let's look at Buddhism. Buddhism came out of Hinduism. Siddhartha Gautama, known as the Buddha, he was born into a Hindu culture, and after he had kind of a life crisis of, wow, I'm really rich, and there's really poor people. Why is that? Why am I rich, but they're poor? It doesn't really make any sense. He went and did some private meditation, and he had this private vision about the way the world works. And he found that, well, there's no such thing as gods. So he strips the Hindu gods out of the system. But what he keeps is the life philosophy of karma and reincarnation. That if you do good, good things will happen. If you do bad, bad things will happen. Why am I rich? Well, it's because my father did good things in his life. So that's why I'm blessed. Why are people poor? Well, because they did bad things. That's why they're poor. So that their bad deeds of their past, when they died and they were reincarnated, they were reincarnated into a poor person. And so that's the Buddhist philosophy. But what's interesting is that the Buddha, he didn't even intend for this philosophy to be a religion of like devout, worshiping practice. It was just like a psychological philosophy on the way life is. It wasn't meant to be a worshipful religion. That's something that was implemented later by some of his followers. But once again, even in Buddhism, there's no claims of specific historical events. There's no claims of objective truth. What about Islam? In 600 AD, you have this guy known as Muhammad, who has these private visions, all by himself, all by his lonesome. You have an angel come down and say, hey, I got this message from God that I want to give to you. And so he's given the Quran. He's told to write the Quran down. And in it, he rewrites large portions of Scripture. So in Muslim religion, you have the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, they're considered okay. And you have the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, they're considered okay. But then there's these contradictions because of Muhammad's writing. He teaches that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, that he wasn't divine, that he didn't die on the cross. He teaches that Jesus and Moses were actually brothers. And so there's all of these contradictions, not just with the Bible, but with all known historical evidence. And so the Quran, Islam, is littered with all of these problems in which their teachings contradict known historical facts. So that shows kind of how genuine their faith is in their religion to deny blatant history because a person had a private vision. When we talk about private visions, let's see, I got the slide backwards. Let's talk about Mormonism for a second. Now this one might step on some toes because we probably have some Mormon friends out there because they're just the nicest people on the block, right? I have some Mormon friends and they are some of the absolute nicest people on the block. I don't deny that. But their religion came from Joseph Smith in 1830 because he received a private vision that is unsubstantiated by historical evidence outside of his private vision. See, Joseph Smith, he said that he received this vision from God about the location of these golden tablets in the United States. And these golden tablets, he goes out and he finds them. And on these golden tablets, it's recorded the history of this lost tribe of Israel and the way that Jesus came to America and was teaching to them. And he gave them all of these new laws. And that it's a second revelation of Jesus that comes after the New Testament. So anything that's taught in the Book of Mormon, it is superior to what's taught in the New Testament because it comes after. It comes several centuries after. So Jesus comes back. He's teaching to these people in the Americas, and he gives them something different than what's found in the New Testament. And now, the problem with this is that Joseph Smith, in his writings, he mentions all of these specific places, cities, people, for which there is zero historical evidence for. Not a shred of it. There's not a single location that he names. There's not a single person that he names. That there is any evidence ever actually existed. Well, that's a pretty big problem. And it's very different when you compare Judaism and Christianity. So when we look at Judaism, we know that Moses is kind of the father of the Mosaic Law. We know he's not the father of God's people. It dates back to Abraham, but even go back further to Adam. But anyway, we have Moses and the subsequent prophets. They write extensively of God's Word. They're considered inspired. But as they're writing, what you find throughout the Old Testament is that it is so rich with historical events that secular studies, secular history, has confirmed. Every single archaeological discovery that's ever been found in any of the places and events that the Old Testament writes about, it's always been confirmed. And that is one of the greatest reasons that we can take all of the Old Testament to be true and reliable. One of the reasons, not the only one, is because every time that it mentions a place or a person in history, when we have a non-biblical reference to it, say we find a temple in Babylon that has the history of Babylon written on it, and it mentions the Jews, and it mentions the exile, and it mentions the kings that are listed that we have in our Bible in the book of Chronicles and Kings, they always line up. And so we can trust that for all of these historical claims that are made, it's true. We have incredible evidence. But nevertheless, even the Old Testament, even the Jewish faith, does not hinge on one specific historical event. You know, say King David actually lived in 500 BC instead of 1000 BC. The entire Jewish system of faith doesn't fall apart on one historical detail. And that's why Christianity is completely unique from every other world religion that's out there, because it's based solely on one single historical event, and that is Jesus died and then he resurrected. That's it. If that happened, then Christianity is true. If Jesus prophesied about his death and resurrection, and then he did, then everything he says about himself is true. He truly was God on earth. All the atheist has to do is prove that he didn't come back to life. And as Paul says, our faith is in vain. And so when we compare these other religions to Christianity, we see a huge difference here, because by Christianity, by the Christian faith, we see that after a public ministry, Christ was killed publicly. And then Christ rose from a public tomb that everyone knew about, and then he publicly showed himself to the public. And the public told everyone that they saw. You see, there is no private vision here going on. Jesus had a very public ministry. He was buried in public property. It was owned by Joseph of Arimathea, but everybody knew where it was. And after he was resurrected, he made public appearances. That is very different than the claims of private visions from these other religions. And so, why do we need to know about this resurrection today? Well, to start with, it differentiates Christianity from all the other religions. Secondly, having a good understanding of Jesus' resurrection from a historical standpoint also makes us seem like a more credible witness for Jesus to our friends. We're not just some kook that says our cousin Larry came back from the dead. We're somebody who actually can defend our belief, can defend our faith. But more importantly for our souls, understanding the resurrection is how we embrace salvation offered by God. Knowing and trusting in the resurrection of Jesus is what allows us to live unafraid of our future and live confidently in our salvation. So with all of that, let's just look at a few pieces of evidence here. So when we get into the science of history, there are certain principles, 5 to be exact, that professional historians, this is their standards for testing what is true and what truly happened, right? Because unlike modern science, unlike science as you think of in like a lab, like what do you do when you split an atom? Well, they can test that in a lab. They can only do it once, but they can do that, right? That's how you make an atomic bomb. There wouldn't be a lab left after it splits, right? But you have science in a lab with like beakers and test tubes and little flame things. You can repeat these things, and you're measuring cause and effect. Can you do that with history, though? Like, how do we know George Washington existed? Right? We can't just mix a little dash of salt, a little bit of chlorine, a little bit of baking soda, and boom, George Washington existed. Like, we can't test that in a lab. So we have to have a different standard of truth, a different standard of validity. And so professional historians, they go by these 5. One, if a historical event has multiple independent sources, that leads to more credibility that it actually happened. So you don't just have one person saying something happened, but you have multiple different people saying something happened. Two, if you have enemy sources. So people that don't want something to be true. If they say that it happened, then it more than likely did happen. Right? Not to pick on the United States a little bit, but even historians from the South admit that they lost the Civil War. Right? That's how we know there was a Civil War and that the North won, because even your Southerners admit it. Right? Enemy sources. Number three, embarrassing details. If ancient writings include details that make them look bad, then it's probably got a lot of truth to it, right? Because we don't normally record things that make us look bad, unless it's true and actually happened. Number four, are there claims of eyewitness details? Is it always just, he said, she said, that he said, that she said, that 500 years ago something happened? Or is it people actually saying, no, I saw this is what happened, and then related to eyewitness testimony is early testimony? Were the writers of these ancient documents actually present early enough to have witnessed it? So, if historical documents meet, they don't have to meet all five. We'll see in a minute that the New Testament does meet all five. But for historical documents, when historians are saying, well, who was Julius Caesar? Did he really exist? Was he really the first emperor? They will compare the history of Rome by these principles. They will compare, did George Washington exist? Well, do we have these types of writings about George Washington being our first president? Or was that just a legend that was spread to increase our hatred for Great Britain, right? Is George Washington just this mythos of patriotism, freedom, hoorah? Or was he a real person? These are the principles that historians use to determine whether an event in the past actually occurred or not. And so with that said, here are the four facts that all historians admit to. Atheist historians, Christian historians, Islamic historians, all historians admit that Jesus died. Actually, Islam might not say that he died. I can't remember for sure now. Aside from that, the rest all say that Jesus died, that the tomb was found empty, that there was an empty tomb, that there were resurrection appearances, that people claimed to see him, and that the origin of the Christian faith rapidly spread because people claim to see him. These are uncontroversial. I know on Facebook, on your local street corner atheist or your barbershop atheist, they a lot of times buy into this story that, well, Jesus never existed. But any actual historian that has studied it cannot deny that Jesus did exist. And so we're going to look at the reasons why. So, number one, did Jesus die on the cross? Well, let's see what an early enemy source says about this. Flavius Josephus, considered one of the greatest Jewish historians, lived in the 1st century. Not only was he Jewish by religion, but he was also a Roman by citizenship, and he was also a military leader. And he writes this about Jesus. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So, from this ancient early enemy source, we see that Jesus was considered a good guy, a wise guy, not sarcastically a wise guy, a genuinely man full of wisdom, that he died by crucifixion, and that his apostles claim to have seen him. But it's not just this one Jewish source either. We have somebody not tied to any semblance of Judaism. That would be Tacitus, who was considered the greatest Roman historian, and he just happened to live in the 1st century. And this is what Tacitus writes about Jesus. Therefore, to stop the rumor, Nero, the emperor of the time, Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, and whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence from the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find abode. Now, talk about an enemy source, an enemy attestation for the resurrection of Jesus, calling Christianity itself a disease. Tacitus writes, yes, Jesus died by Pontius Pilate's death sentence, and in that death, the Christian movement stopped for a brief time, and then immediately afterward broke out and spread across the Roman Empire. This is somebody living in the first century who was an enemy to the Christian faith, who was admitting that Jesus was not only a real person, but he had amassed a large number of followers, that he died, and that he was seen afterwards. Okay? And just to get a contemporary one, just to get an atheist scholar from today, John Dominic Crossan, he's an atheist historian, says that Jesus was crucified is as sure as any historical event can ever be. So, here we have multiple early independent enemy sources. Right there, without even opening the Bible, we have checked the block on 3 of the most important types of evidences we can have to determine whether a historical event is true or not. So let's continue on. Now the objection to this is that, well, he didn't actually die. He only appeared to have died. The problem is that there is not one single ancient writing that argues this. This is a modern objection. There's not a single ancient writing dealing with Christianity that says that Jesus didn't actually die. They're unanimous that he died. And the suffering that Jesus endured was medically unsurvivable. We know that through medical science today, and the types of torture that the Roman soldiers would subject their crucified victims to, it's medically unsurvivable. Furthermore, we know that if the Roman soldiers failed to ensure the person hanging on the cross died, they would die. So they had really good reason to make sure their victims were dead. So what about the empty tomb? What's some evidence we have for the empty tomb? Well, I want to share this quote from, now this is a Christian philosopher, William Lane Craig, on his assessment of this. He's known today as the world's leading Christian philosopher. And he says, it would have been wholly un-Jewish, not to say foolish, to believe that a man was raised from the dead when his body was still in the grave. And so this assessment is very important because of the term un-Jewish and foolish. So he's basing this on the Jewish culture of the time. You see, it was very un-Jewish. You see, prior to Jesus, there was not a common Jewish understanding of a physical, bodily resurrection before final judgment day. There was no expectation of that. Furthermore, the common Jewish understanding was that the Messiah that was foretold would be a military leader like King David, who would restore the United Kingdom of Israel and vanquish their political enemies. That was the common Jewish expectation of the time. There's even some historical speculation that Barabbas, the man whose place Jesus took on the cross, that Barabbas was actually viewed by some Jews as a Messiah figure because he was a political adversary to Rome and was actually trying to instigate a revolt against the government. And so you have this trade-off between Barabbas, a political Messiah, and Jesus, a spiritual Messiah. Barabbas is actually a figure that better fits the bill for what the Jews were expecting. Now, furthermore, not only was it un-Jewish to think that Jesus would raise from the dead, it would also be foolish to say that he was raised from the dead. Why would it be foolish? Because the tomb's right there. They could go look. Right? They could simply go see if the tomb is empty or not. You have people on the ground able to fact check this. So it would have been very foolish to make up this story that the tomb is empty when literally everyone in the city can just walk down the street and say, oh yeah, oh, it is empty. Now, when we consider some other factors, this adds to the credibility of the empty tomb. So, number one is that the women were the first one at the tomb. Right? It would make zero sense to make up this story of Jesus' tomb being found empty, to have the women be the first one. And the reason is that women at this time, they have no legal voice. So if they were testified in court, their testimony would be thrown out. They were, no offense to ladies, at this time, women were considered gossipers. And because they were known to be a gossiping type of people, you couldn't trust what they said in court. Right? So that was the belief at the time. So, knowing that a woman's testimony could not hold up in court, why would these New Testament writers, why would Jesus' disciples make up this story that it was actually the women that were the first witnesses to the empty tomb? It makes no sense. There's no reason for them to make it up. Furthermore, it's pretty embarrassing to the disciples that the chosen 12 of Jesus, while they're cowering in their own mourning and depression over Jesus' death, it's the women that go to the tomb. Kind of makes them look bad. Kind of makes them look like not very good followers. But furthermore, the Jews responded to this, to the empty tomb. The Jews said, yeah, but the body was stolen. By admitting that the body's stolen, even the Jewish enemies are saying, yeah, the tomb's empty. There's no body there. We don't know what happened to it. So we know with pretty good certainty that the tomb truly was empty. And furthermore, and lastly, once again, there is zero ancient documents that claim that the tomb is not empty. Right? There's no ancient sources. Again, this is a modern objection that the tomb was not actually empty. We have no documents that say that. Everything from history says the tomb is actually empty. We don't have time to go through all of the answers to this objection that, the disciples stole the body. Okay? Well, I'll just stick with one or two of these for sake of time. A stolen body can't answer for the literally hundreds of acclaimed appearances of Jesus' resurrection. It also doesn't answer the fact that to steal a body would be to desecrate yourself. In Jewish law and in Jewish custom, if you touched a dead body and you weren't the one responsible for taking care of it, whatever embalming practice they had, if you touched a dead body, you were then considered unclean. So to steal this body would be to violate Jewish law. And so we just have a number of reasons why this stolen body theory doesn't hold up. And possibly one of the greatest ones comes from the scholar N.T. Wright. He says, if your favorite Messiah got himself crucified, then you either went home or else you got yourself a new Messiah. But the idea of stealing Jesus' corpse and saying that God had raised him from the dead is hardly one that would have entered the minds of the disciples. So once again, because Jesus didn't meet the expectations of the Messiah, there was no reason to steal the body. There were plenty of people throughout the hundreds of years before Jesus and hundreds of years after Jesus that claimed to be a Messiah, and as soon as they died, what did the people do? Oh, well, I guess he wasn't the Messiah. Let's go look for the next one. So it would have gone against every Jewish custom to steal the body. But let's move on. The resurrection appearances. So what claims exist stating that people saw Jesus? Well, we've already seen one from Josephus, a non-Christian historian. But I'll share this quote from an atheist historian and New Testament scholar still alive today by the name of Gerd Ludman. He says that it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. You see, amongst professional historians, even atheist historians, it is accepted as historical fact that people saw Jesus after his death. Now, they say that it was a hallucination, which is a really bad theory for a lot of reasons that we might hit one or two of those. But it is an accepted fact that people genuinely did claim to see Jesus. There's no question. But how can we be so historically certain of this? As I already mentioned, we have writers like Josephus and Tacitus that are enemies to Christianity that are admitting these events happened. But furthermore, we have the New Testament itself. Now, wait a minute. How are you going to use the Bible to show that the Bible is true? Isn't that circular reasoning? Well, that's the argument that's often given on Facebook or in the barber shops. But the truth is, that's not how historians look at the Bible. Professional historians, even atheist historians, they look at the Bible as documents that were written by real people in the first century. And so they have to answer, why would people write these documents? And furthermore, across these documents, not just in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, every single historical detail that's mentioned in these documents regarding a person, a place, a thing, or an event, secular history has always confirmed that to be true. We have nothing but good reasons to believe that when the New Testament says a person, place, thing, or event happened, that it actually did. Because all of archaeology outside of the Bible itself has confirmed them. So we can believe that what they say is reportedly true. What they report is true. They're considered as genuine historical documents. Furthermore, the writing style of the New Testament authors does not match the writing style in the first century for spreading legends and myths. Right? Just like today, if you go to the library and you walk into the fiction section of books, and you pull a book off the shelf and you open it up and you start reading through it, it's going to have a certain tone, it's going to have a certain language, it's going to have a certain rhythm. You're going to be like, oh, this is fiction. But then if you go to the non-fiction section and you pick up a history book and you open it up, and by the time you're on page 2, you're falling asleep. Why? Because it's a very different writing style. The writing style of the New Testament is in the exact same writing style as non-biblical documents of this time as being a historical narrative. So the writing style matches perfectly with what we'd expect to find if what they're reporting is something that they actually saw or engaged with or interacted with. Furthermore, I have this chart on the screen. I tried to make it as large as I could to see the difference between the New Testament writings and the credibility that we have for all these other non-Christian writings that are taken as historically true. Take, for example, the writings of Julius Caesar that were originally written around between 100 to 44 BC. The earliest copy of Caesar's writings that we have comes nearly 1,000 years later, and we only have 10 copies. And yet, historians say, this is accurate. This is truly Caesar's writings. We'll talk about Josephus, considered to give historically accurate, factual information. He wrote in 80 AD. The earliest copy we have is from 950. So once again, we have close to 1,000 years, and there's not even a number of manuscripts up there, but it's not very many. This was just a screen grab. I didn't make this myself. But it's only a handful, and yet his writings are considered genuine history. Let's just look at one more. Let's look at Aristotle, because most people have at least heard of Aristotle. I know that with our dwindling public education system, he's probably not taught as much as he used to be. That's okay. Aristotle wasn't a perfect guy either. He had some wrong things. But anyway, Aristotle, one of history's most well-known philosophers, was writing in the 300s BC, and yet the earliest copy of his writings that we have is from 1100 AD. Almost 1,500 years after his writing, and we only have 49 of those copies. And yet, when it comes to all of these other historical figures, you don't hear questions of, yeah, but look at this time gap. I mean, 1,500 years, like, somebody could have changed that, right? Somebody could have doctored it a little bit. How do we know it's actually from them? Well, because the professional historians, they have this checklist that we talked about at the beginning of our lesson, and if it meets this checklist, then with very good certainty, we can take these claims to be accurate. And then we compare that to the New Testament. Written in the first century, within a time frame to allow for eyewitnesses to be there. The oldest copy we have now, it's not the entire New Testament, but we have shreds of manuscript, shreds of writing that date to 125 AD. So we're talking really only less than 100 years after the original writings, and we have over 5,000 copies. of New Testament writings, dating from as early as 125 AD up through the next millennia and a half of writings. And so the New Testament is the single most well-attested ancient historical writing that we have. And that's why even in professional scholarship, even amongst atheists, they cannot deny the history that is recorded in the New Testament. They just deny that Jesus was God and resurrected, but they accept everything else. And so the point in all that is that we can trust that Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and Peter and Paul, that they were genuine, authentic historical writers who were simply recording history. Now, the number one objection to this is that they merely hallucinated the resurrection. The problem with this is that there has never been a confirmed group hallucination. So in the terms of psychology, not once in all scientific endeavor has there been a confirmed group hallucination. So we have no reason to believe that that's what was happening with Jesus. Furthermore, in this time period of Jesus, if you had a vision or a hallucination of a dead person, that was confirmation that they were dead, not that they resurrected. The belief was they died, and now you're seeing their spirit. There was no claim of, well, if I see, quote unquote, this person, that means they're resurrected. The common belief at the time was if you saw this vision of a person who's dead, that meant you're seeing basically their ghost. Furthermore, all the resurrection reports that we have in history through the New Testament talk about a bodily resurrection. It wasn't some spirit. And then, again, where did the body go if it was only an hallucination, right? If they only hallucinated Jesus resurrected, there would still be a body sitting in the tomb, but we know that the tomb was empty and the body was missing. All right, so we'll wrap up here with this last one. And that's the origin of the Christian faith. It was unique, it was rapid, and it was transforming unlike any other religion in the history of the universe. It was unique in that no other religion began or endured like the Christian faith, being founded on one specific historical event. Islam, private vision. Hinduism, we don't know. Buddhism, private vision. Mormon, private vision. Christianity, a public historical event that people began following, and following rapidly. It spread throughout the entire Roman Empire within one generation. And it did that spreading with no incentive to convert to Christianity. If you were a Jew and you became a Christian, you know what that got you? Well, you lost your job, you lost all your money, you lost all your finances, you lost all your family, you lost all your friends, and most likely you would lose your life. That's what becoming a Christian would get you. You would lose everything, which is what Jesus foretold. You must be willing to give up your life to follow him. And history records nothing but Christians willingly giving up everything because they valued the truth of Jesus' resurrection. And then lastly, the resurrection was transformative. Even critics to the Christian faith, we know that Paul and James, real historical people, Jesus' brother James, Saul, before he was known as Paul, a Pharisee, had no reason to convert, especially Saul, who would be Paul, had nothing but to lose by becoming a Christian. And yet, it is their conversion today that is great evidence for the truth of the resurrection. And so, we'll close with this final slide. The words from Jesus, I am the resurrection and the life. So I tried to cram as much evidence for the historical resurrection as I could into an approximately 30 going on 40-minute lesson for you guys. But there's so much more out there that if you're interested in this, you can just do a little bit of digging into how many volumes of history and of evidence we have to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. But it needs to be more than just a historical fact for us. Right? Because we know that even the demons believe in Jesus. Even the demons confess him as Lord. They know the fact of who Jesus is. And we need to do more than simply know the fact of Jesus. We need to live in light of the resurrection. Jesus' tomb was empty so that our life doesn't have to be. Our life can be filled with the purpose of living for God. To love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. His resurrection gives us the purpose in this life, but gives us the assurance for our eternity. So the resurrection proved that Jesus was who he said he was. And it is only through him that we can discover the full sense of meaning and purpose that God has given us in this lifetime. It's only because of that resurrection that we can receive forgiveness of sins, that we can have the hope of a united home with God and with all fellow believers. And so we'll close with this question. Do you truly believe in the resurrection? And not just believe it historically, but do you trust in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus? Because if you're not placing your trust in that, then your faith is in vain. That is the only event that brings our salvation and brings forgiveness. If you are placing your trust in that resurrection, have you died yet? Have you died like Jesus? Have you died in the waters of baptism to be raised with a resurrection like Christ? And if you have, are you continuing to live in that new life, living as a resurrected new creation who walks with the Spirit and lives a life loving God first before all else? And if you're not living for God today, then how can we help you? How can we pray with you? How can we pray for you? How can we walk beside you and help you to overcome whatever is holding you back from a relationship with Jesus today? So whatever your needs are, Wes, that you would let us know as together stand.